Welcome everyone. Today I'll talk about the energy transition, a critical step we need to take to stop emitting greenhouse gases. The transition to net zero carbon is one of the greatest challenges humanity faces in the 21st century. It is a globally agreed goal to mitigate global warming in the second half of this century, and while the goal itself is clear, the path to achieving it is much less so. With all the troubling news about the future of our planet, you might have asked yourself, as I have, is achieving this even possible? And if it is, what will it take? In this talk, I'll explore those questions by putting the energy transition into the context of humanity's monumental achievements. By the end of this talk, I'll promise you'll see paper differently. Yes, paper. That might sound odd now, but bear with me, it'll make sense soon. Now let's dive in. The first question I asked myself was, what's the biggest project a society can tackle, and how much effort can we realistically commit to that? To find out, I looked at examples of monumental undertakings from different times and places. Then I tried to figure out how much of society's total productivity went into making those projects happen. The first thing that came to my mind was the pyramids of Giza. The Great Pyramid of the pharaoh Cheops was built around 2600 BC. It took roughly 20 years to complete. I tried estimating the costs and comparing them to Egypt's economy back then, but reliable data was scarce. What I did find was an estimate that about 2.5 to 3% of Egypt's population worked on the pyramid at any given time. That's a good measure of effort compared to the kingdom's resources. Of course, the workforce wasn't constant. Construction ebbed and flowed with the seasons, especially during harvest, and the type of work needed. So while the numbers aren't exact, they give us a useful ballpark. The next example is the Great Wall of China, an extraordinary project spanning more than 2,000 years. The most intense period of construction was during the Ming Dynasty in the 16th century, when 25,000 watchtowers were built. Estimates suggest that during this time, construction consumed up to 1% of China's GDP. For perspective, the wall contains 100 million tons of stone compared to the 6 million tons used in the Great Pyramid. While this estimate is less precise than others, it highlights the massive scale of this effort. Another example I looked into is the Gothic cathedrals of France. During the 12th and 13th century, about 2.5% of the working population in France was involved in building cathedrals. This is similar to the percentage of workers who built the pyramids in Egypt. However, medieval France had over 10 million people, while ancient Egypt had only about 2 million. This means that absolute amount of labor invested in the cathedrals was significantly greater. This is another way to put these numbers into perspective. Now, how do these examples compare to modern projects? Let's first look at the Transcontinental Railway in the United States. For this project, the data is quite well documented. Construction costs amounted to about 0.5% of US GDP during the 1860s. Compared to the railway, the Apollo program was almost a bargain. Over a decade in the 1960s, the Apollo program required investments of only about 0.3% of US GDP annually. I think you're starting to see the picture, but I have a few more examples to share, including some from very different categories. The first one is war. Unlike the constructive projects we've discussed so far, wars show how much a society can mobilize for destruction. World Wars I and II stand out as extreme examples. Here we saw a rapid surge in investments that eventually collapsed. Countries began with substantial commitments, which grew until they could no longer be sustained. By 1945, Germany directed all available resources at any cost into the war effort, about 75% of its GDP. The US devoted about 40% of its GDP in the same year. Even more disastrous was the situation of the Russian Empire at the end of World War I, when it spent nearly twice its GDP. This could only be sustained through massive borrowing. When we believe our survival is at risk, we often commit vast resources to destruction. It's crucial to stress that we must avoid repeating such mistakes. Our productivity today is far greater than it was in 1945, just as 1945 was far ahead of the era of the 30 Years' War, for example. We now hold the terrifying power to wipe out all life on Earth with the press of a single button. So, one final example, disaster recovery. The COVID-19 pandemic response in 2020 can be viewed as the most expensive project in history, costing the equivalent of about 1/3 of global GDP that year. This demonstrates that when faced with a crisis, humanity can marshal resources on an unprecedented scale. Regarding these levels of effort, one question appears: how to compare the ability of societies during different eras to mobilize resources for large undertakings. For most of human history, the majority of people worked just to survive. To put this into figures, 2 farmers could feed only 3 people in medieval France. This started to change at the beginning of the 20th century. By 1930 in Italy, 1 farmer could already feed 2 people. Today, 1 farmer in the US can already feed more than 100 people. This dramatic shift freed up resources that allowed us to take on bigger and bigger projects. So to make fair comparisons across time, I've measured the level of effort as a percentage of excess productivity, hence all effort that is not needed to provide basic nutrition. So France dedicating 2.5% of its total workforce to cathedral construction corresponds to 7.5% of the workforce not working on providing nutrition. And these 7.5% are what I call excess productivity. Now, let's put these results into perspective. This graph shows time on the x-axis, moving back toward from today at the rightmost side on a logarithmic scale. On the y-axis, we see the percentages of excess productivity dedicated to each project, also on a logarithmic scale. The gray area illustrates how per capita productivity has grown over time, enabling societies to undertake increasingly ambitious projects. Let's now add the projects we've discussed to this graph, grouped into somewhat arbitrary categories. First, cultural projects like the pyramids and cathedrals. These were massive undertakings that represented the values and ambitions of their societies, though it must be said that forced labor was used to realize them. Next, infrastructure projects like the Great Wall of China, the Transcontinental Railway in the US, and more modern endeavors like the Interstate Highway Network or China's Belt and Road Initiative. These projects shaped the physical and economic landscape of their respective regions. What about humanity's drive for innovation? Technological projects such as the Manhattan Project and the Apollo program highlight this. These reflect humanity's ability to channel resources into exploration and discovery, often over relatively short periods. Military spending is another category. Here, I've included examples like the Russian Empire during World War I, then Germany and the US at the end of World War II, and then US military spending throughout the Cold War. These efforts demonstrate how much a society can commit when it perceives an existential threat. Finally, disaster relief. I've included examples like the 2008 global financial crisis and the COVID-19 pandemic in 2020. These stand out for the speed and scale of the resources mobilized to address urgent challenges. The key takeaway from this graph is that societies throughout history, across different countries, have been able to realize substantial projects and mobilize significant resources. If there's a strong enough need for incentive, humanity has consistently exceeded 1% of available excess productivity, and in some cases, far more. This brings us to the second part of the presentation. In this section, I'll examine how the use of fuel has significantly boosted our productivity and how energy infrastructure itself has become a monumental achievement. Let's look at the historical development of energy consumption. The graph shows total primary energy consumption over time divided by fuel source. On the right, the same data is shown as percentages of total energy use. Two major transitions stand out. The shift from bioenergy to coal, triggered by the first industrial revolution and lasting until about 1910. The shift from coal to oil and gas, which began around 1920 and lasted until the first oil crisis in 1973. More recently, we see the start of a third transition to renewables after about 2000. However, this transition has not yet progressed as rapidly as the earlier ones. One observation is that the pace that we see in the transition towards renewables is not greater than the adoption of coal. What triggered some of these energy transitions? Let me share a fascinating example from the second transition from coal to oil. In 1911, the British Navy made the decision to power their dreadnought warships with oil engines instead of coal engines. This shift had far-reaching consequences for the oil industry and geopolitics, especially in the Middle East, and some of the consequences of that we can still see today. The man behind this decision? Winston Churchill, who served as First Lord of the Admiralty at this time. Now let's reflect on how fuel consumption underpins our civilization. Why is fuel consumption so important for productivity? Well, it enables machines to amplify the work that we can perform, allowing us to create more value and more prosperity. We see a graph showing per capita GDP, a measure of productivity against per capita fuel consumption in Great Britain from 1560 to 2000. The graph shows two regimes, one before about 1950 and one after. From 1560 to 1950, GDP grew linearly with fuel consumption as fuel primarily powered processes mimicking human labor. After 1950, productivity grew still roughly linearly, but now 10 times faster with the same fuel input. The usual suspect for this disruption is mass production. This highlights the critical role of fuel for driving prosperity. The second graph on the right shows how important fuel consumption is for a society. It compares energy use per person to income per person in 2020. The connection is clear. Countries that use a lot of energy are rich, while those with little energy access are not. How has humanity's productivity evolved over time? This graph highlights the incredible strides we've made. It shows the GDP per person over the last 2,000 years. On the x-axis, we see the same logarithmic scale for time as before. On the y-axis, the number 1 represents the extreme poverty limit of $2.15 per day. One thing is remarkable. Humanity has been capable of producing enough to lift everyone out of extreme poverty as we see it today, approximately 1,000 years ago. Today, global productivity is 25 times higher than that threshold, yet the disparity in income between the richest and the poorest countries remains vast and significant. To lift every single person on the planet above the $10 per day limit, a common poverty threshold, it would require less than 10% of global GDP. This underscores how much capacity we have, but it shows as well a massive problem with global prosperity distribution. This final graph on fuel consumption highlights how much GDP is invested in the energy infrastructure. Globally, we've invested around 3% of GDP in energy infrastructure over the last decade. Now, do you remember my earlier point about energy infrastructure being a monumental achievement? This is why. Allocating 3% of GDP qualifies it as the most ambitious infrastructure investment ever. Now here's the good news. Since 2019, we have consistently invested more into renewable energy resources than in fossil fuels. However, the bad news is that investments in fossil fuels have not been reduced as much as they should be. This brings us to the third and final part of the presentation. Now we will look at some key aspects of the third energy transition, the one towards net zero carbon. How do we summarize the story so far? Our civilization has become incredibly productive, more than ever before. This unprecedented productivity is one of humanity's defining features. On the positive side, it has lifted half of the human population from below extreme poverty to above extreme poverty in the last 100 years alone. This would not have been possible without fuel consumption. On the negative side, it has driven massive carbon emission, which has destabilized the global climate. The challenge we face now is to decouple prosperity from carbon emission. But how? Renewable technology like wind, solar, battery storage and power-to-X systems make this possible. With large-scale deployment, they can power a global transition to a net zero carbon energy system. Studies estimate that this transition will require annual investments ranging from $3 to $7 trillion. A share of this funding aligns with efforts already underway, while the remainder represents additional investments needed.
These additional efforts correspond to about 0.7 to 1.2% of global GDP.
Now, how does this level of effort compare to past projects? A 1% GDP effort for the energy transition is comparable to projects like the Transcontinental Railway or China's Belt and Road Initiative at its peak. This shows that while the energy transition is a massive undertaking, it's well within the range of what humanity has accomplished before. There is one novel aspect though, and it's a severe one. Past efforts were largely national in scope, but achieving net zero carbon energy is about managing our global influence on the climate. This effort requires unprecedented commitment and coordination on a global scale. Unfortunately, current frameworks like the COP meetings are unable to generate the commitment needed. Historically, humanity has created institutions to address crises, such as the League of Nations or the United Nations. The challenge of climate change may demand a similar step forward: global institutions and global commitment with the power to act decisively. So, what if we embrace the global transition to net zero energy as a monumental, civilization-defining endeavor? I've adjusted the slide designed to reflect its significance on par with historic achievement such as the pyramids and the Transcontinental Railway. The global transition to net zero carbon could become a monumental, civilization-defining achievement on par with the pyramids, railway, or space exploration. One crucial step is to change the narrative. We often talk about the energy transition in terms of costs and disruptions. Instead, we should frame it as an investment with significant benefits. Renewables like solar and wind pay for themselves within a decade and create profits for decades after that. The studies I've showed before estimate the transition could boost global GDP by 0.4% annually. This would deliver total benefits of $26 trillion. This would be more than enough even to pay for the next pandemic. But that's not all. Beyond financial benefits, the energy transition offers immense potential for job creation. It's estimated that transitioning to a renewable energy system could create 10 to 15 million new jobs worldwide. However, this also presents a challenge, training approximately 200 million people to meet the demands of this transformation. And there's even more. The transition to renewable energy also offers significant health benefits. By improving air quality, we could save at least 2 million lives annually, lives that are currently lost to pollution-related illnesses. This is a powerful argument to accelerating the shift to clean energy. One more. Renewable energy has the potential to reduce inequality by lowering barriers to electricity access. Impoverished communities and marginalized groups benefit most from improved access to energy. Particularly women benefit when reliable energy becomes available, empowering them socially and economically. Additionally, energy access helps to reduce conflicts and promote peace. This makes renewable energy not only an environmental solution, but also a tool for fostering global stability. And a final point. Let's contrast the benefits of action with the cost of inaction. History has shown that disaster relief is often more expensive than disaster prevention. The same is true for climate change. The cost of failing to act far outweigh the investments required for the energy transition. One report estimates that the economic damage from unchecked climate change could result in a 10% reduction in global GDP. This alone would lead to a massive global crisis. Compared to this, we only need a relatively small investment to mitigate these risks. To sum up, transitioning to a net zero energy system is a monumental project, but it's not beyond our capabilities. Humanity has mobilized similar or even greater efforts in the past. This challenge, however, is unique. It requires unprecedented global cooperation and commitment. If we act, we can look forward to a prosperous future with a perspective for next generations. If we fail to act, the consequences for society will be dire. The cost of inaction far exceeds the cost of action. Our incredible productivity has created significant challenges, but it also provides us with the tools to overcome them. And now let's return to paper. Every year, we produce enough paper to create 100 trillion pages, around 10,000 pages per person on the planet. Of these, approximately 1/4, or 20 to 25 trillion pages, are plain paper. In comparison, we produce only about 5 trillion plastic bags. This makes paper sheets, not plastic bags, the most emblematic product of our civilization. To me, this is a hopeful sign. It reflects our nature as being driven by communication rather than mere consumption. If this is true, then recognizing the monumental challenges ahead can inspire us to progress, not just as individuals, but as a global society.